A coffee shop in Chicago. December cold pushing through the door. Vienna Hollis walks in. And for the first time in 3.5 years, she is not in a suit. Dark jeans, gray cashmere. Her hair, pinned every day for 2 decades in courtrooms and conference rooms across 3 continents, is down. She crosses the room. She sits across from a woman she has not spoken to in 14 months. A woman who walked out of her office on a Thursday night after a wall got hit, and a question got asked, and a sentence got said that neither of them was supposed to say. She places her hands flat on the table. She looks up. She speaks. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Let me back up. You have to understand who Vienna Hollis was before you can understand what it meant for her hand to hit a wall. You have to understand that this was a woman who had argued before the Second Circuit at 34, made equity partner at 38, and who had, in the entire time I had known her, never raised her voice in any conference room or any deposition or any meeting with a client whose company was about to lose $500 million on the strength of her recommendation. You do not raise your voice when you are Vienna Hollis. You drop it. You drop it until the entire room is leaning forward to catch the next word, and by the time they catch it, the negotiation is already over and they have already lost. She was 43 years old. She wore charcoal suits in winter and slate gray suits in summer, and a single platinum watch on her right wrist that she had inherited from a great aunt she never spoke about. Her hair was dark and pinned in the same low knot every day she came to the office, and the only place I had ever seen it down was in a black and white photograph on the firm's website, taken the year she made partner, in which she was looking past the camera at something the photographer had clearly not been able to compete with. Her tells were small. The half-second pause before she answered a question she had already decided how to answer. The flex of her jaw when opposing counsel said something she found beneath the discussion. The way her thumb would press, once, against the underside of a fountain pen when a client pushed her past the line of what she would tolerate. I had been her associate for 3 years. I knew every one of those tells the way you know your own pulse. My name is Tate Marlowe. I am 29. I went to a public law school in the Midwest because my mother was a court reporter for 31 years, and the only thing she had ever asked of me was that I not make her co-sign on debt for a school whose name she could not pronounce. I made law review on grades alone, clerked for a federal judge in the Eastern District, and was hired into Whitfield Sterling Hollis as a third-year associate by a recruiter who told me, on a phone call I had taken in my car in a parking lot, that Vienna Hollis had read my clerkship memo on a circuit split in arbitration enforcement and had asked HR to find me. She had asked HR to find me. That was the sentence the recruiter had used. I drove home that afternoon with my hands shaking on the wheel. Because I was 26, and I had never been asked for by anyone in this profession, and I did not know yet what it would cost to be asked for by Vienna Hollis specifically. I learned over time. The first thing she taught me was how to read a room before I walked into it. She would stop me in the hallway before a partner meeting and ask, without looking up from whatever she was reading on her tablet, who is going to be the problem in there? Not who will object. Not who will push back. Who is going to be the problem? The phrasing was hers, and she demanded it from me, because she said it forced you to think about people the way they actually moved instead of the way you wish they did. I learned, eventually, to answer her without preamble. Brennan, because the deal touches his book of business and he has not been told. Or, the client's GC, because she is going to want to be seen pushing back, and I have not preceded her with the language she needs. Vienna would nod, once, without ever telling me I was right, and we would walk into the room. The second thing she taught me was that praise from her was a thing you did not ask for and would not receive. Praise was structural. Praise was the next assignment. If your work was bad, you would know, because the next thing she handed you would be small and contained and easily salvageable. If your work was good, The next thing she handed you would be larger than the last and would carry actual risk. By the end of my first year, I was writing the deposition outlines for a partner track case that was supposed to be staffed by a senior associate. By the end of my second year, I was second chairing a federal trial that ended in our client paying nothing, which the firm had not predicted and the client had not dared to hope for. The week the verdict came in, Vienna stopped at my desk and set a coffee cup down and said, "The cross on their damages expert was the right cross," and walked away. She did not say I had done a good job. She did not need to. She had handed me the cross. She had let me run it. She had not asked me about it once during preparation. The coffee was the entire conversation. The third thing she taught me, and the one I did not understand for a long time, was the difference between being seen and being noticed. Vienna Hollis noticed everything. That was simply who she was. She noticed which of the partners were drinking too much at the holiday party and adjusted their caseloads accordingly the following Monday. She noticed which paralegals were being underpaid relative to their actual contribution and got them moved up. She noticed when the receptionist's mother had been sick and asked, exactly twice, whether she was okay, and never asked again because she did not have to. What Vienna Hollis did with me was different. She saw me. There is no other word for it. She would walk past my desk at 6:15 in the evening and notice that I was still on the same draft I had been working on at 4, and 10 minutes later, a different partner, never her, would stop by my desk to say that she could take the rest of the comments on the document overnight and I should go eat something. She would notice that I had skipped lunch on a Tuesday, and on Wednesday morning a sandwich would appear at my desk with no name on the bag and no note, just the right sandwich from the right place. She would notice when I had taken the red-eye back from a deposition, and when I came in the next morning, my 8 a.m. meeting would have been quietly moved to 10 without anyone telling me who had moved it. None of these things had her name on them. All of them were her. I learned to recognize her in the absence of her signature. The way you learn to recognize a person's footsteps from down a hallway, or the specific weight of someone's hand on your shoulder before you have turned around. I knew when something at my desk was from Vienna because no one else paid attention that closely, and because no one else would have arranged for the credit to fall on someone else, and because the things that came from her arrived without acknowledgement and were never spoken of again. I never thanked her. She had constructed the system precisely so that thanking her would be impossible. I did not understand for the first year. I thought it was simply how she ran her associates, the kind of mentorship that was more thorough than anything I had been promised in law school, more invested than I had ever expected from a woman with a billable rate of $2,000 an hour. I thought I was lucky. I thought she was the rare partner who actually built her associates instead of burning through them. It was Margot Ivor who told me, in a hotel bar in Houston after a long day of depositions, that I was being a fool. Margot was a partner. She was 61 years old, had been at the firm for 28 of those years, and had developed, over the course of her career, the specific clarity of a woman who had stopped caring about institutional politeness somewhere around her third divorce. She drank old fashions and tipped bartenders 30% and treated junior associates the way she treated her grandchildren, which was to say with an exhausted affection that occasionally cracked into something useful. That night in Houston, she watched me check my phone 3 times in 20 minutes and finally set down her glass and said, "Sweetheart, you know she watches you, right?" I said, "Who?" Margot said, "Oh, please." I said, "Margot. She's the partner on the case. She's checking in." Margot said, "Vienna Hollis does not check in. Vienna Hollis informs you when there is something you need to know. There is a difference. And you, who are smart, are choosing not to see it." I drank. The bar was loud. The Houston heat had not dropped even at 10 p.m., and the windows were sweating with it. Margot said, "I have known Vienna Hollis since she was a second-year associate at Cravath, and I was her senior on a securities matter that nearly killed both of us. In 23 years, I have never once seen her allow the thing she does for you to be done for any other associate. Not for her own goddamned son when he summered here, which is its own story for another bottle of wine. Not for any of the boys she has taken under her wing and made into partners. Just you. I said, "What is the thing?" Margot said, "You know exactly what the thing is. And the fact that you are asking me means you are getting close to deciding what to do about it. So I am going to tell you something." She picked up her glass. "Vienna Hollis," Margot said, "has been in love with one woman in her entire life that I am aware of. They were together for 11 years. The woman died of a glioblastoma at 36, very fast, and Vienna took 6 weeks of leave that she would not have taken if the firm had not put her on it. And when she came back, she ran the largest case the firm had at the time and won it, and she has not, to my knowledge, been with anyone seriously since. That was 9 years ago." I sat with the glass in my hand. The bar was still loud. Margot said, "She does not flirt. She does not date. She works. She has constructed an entire interior architecture out of work, and she is extremely good at maintaining it, and she has done it for 9 years." She set her glass down. "And then," Margot said, "you walked into her office. She paid for the drinks. She did not let me argue. She walked me to the elevator and patted my shoulder once and said, 'Sleep on what I told you, kid. Decide whether you want to know the rest of it. Vienna will not tell you. She will go to her grave not telling you. That is the deal she has made with herself, and she will keep it. The question is whether you are going to keep it for her.'" I went to my room. I did not sleep. I sat by the window with the lights off and looked at the city, and I did not let myself think about the conversation directly. I thought about it sideways, the way you have to think about things that are too bright to look at straight on. The next morning, Vienna was in the deposition room at 7:15, which was earlier than the deposition required. She was in a charcoal suit, pinned hair, the platinum watch. She had brought coffee for both of us. She set mine down without looking at me and said, "The deponent is going to lie about the second email chain. We are going to let him." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because his lie is more useful than his truth, and we want him on record telling it." I said, "Understood." She said, "Are you all right?" Without looking up. Reading her notes. I said, "Why do you ask?" She said, "You didn't sleep." I said, "Neither did you." She said, "I never do. Eat something before they come in." We ran the deposition. The deponent lied about the second email chain. We let him. 3 weeks later, when we used the recording in a motion to compel, the case turned on it. In the cab back to the airport, I sat next to Vienna and watched the lights of the highway pass on her face and thought about Margot Ivor's face the night before and decided that I was 27 years old and that the conversation I was having with myself was not going to resolve itself in this cab and would not resolve itself in any cab. It would have to resolve itself in time. I gave it time. I gave it 18 months. I worked the cases I was assigned. I worked the cases that were specifically her cases, which by my 3rd year was almost all of them, because Vienna Hollis had constructed a practice in which I was the senior associate she trusted with the documents and the witnesses, and the closing arguments she could not personally write because she had to be in 3 other cities. I traveled with her. I sat in conference rooms in London and Frankfurt and Singapore. I learned the shape of her exhaustion at hour 14 of a negotiation, and the precise moment when she would push back from the table and ask for a break she did not need, but that an opposing partner had needed for 40 minutes and would not request. I learned the way she pronounced certain client names when she did not respect them, and the way she pronounced others. I learned that her office smelled, faintly, of cedar and citrus, and that the smell came from a fragrance she had had custom blended at a small shop on the Upper West Side that she had once mentioned to me in passing on a flight, in the kind of throwaway sentence she rarely permitted herself, and that I had committed to memory and never spoken of again. I learned that when she was tired she pressed the inside of her left wrist against her temple, briefly, the way someone might check their own pulse, and that this was the only physical tell she allowed herself in front of an associate. I learned that she watched my hands, not constantly, not obviously, but on the days when I came back from court with my hands still shaking from the adrenaline of having argued my first motion against opposing counsel 20 years my senior, she would notice the shaking, and she would set a glass of water in front of me without comment, and she would not stop watching until my hands had steadied. I learned that she was waiting for me to leave. I do not know exactly when I figured this out. Sometime in the second year. Sometime in the long stretch of months when the work was getting better and the silences were getting longer, and she was taking more care with the line between what was professional and what was something else. Not less. The taking more care was the signal. People only take more care when there is more to manage. People who are in nothing, who feel nothing, have nothing to take care of. They simply do their work and go home. Vienna took care like a woman diffusing something. There was a night in the second year I have not let myself remember in detail because remembering it in detail is a thing I will not survive doing more than once or twice a year. We were in London. We had been in mediation for 3 days, opposite a German pharmaceutical company that was prepared to scorch the earth rather than settle a patent dispute that they had already lost on the merits, but were emotionally unwilling to concede. Vienna had been in mediation for 31 hours across 3 sessions. I had been beside her for all of them. The hotel was a small old building near Holborn that the firm used because the rooms were quiet and the breakfast was good, and on the third night, around 11, after the German General Council had finally agreed to the framework of a settlement that we had proposed at hour 8 of session 1, Vienna and I went back to the hotel and ended up at the small bar in the lobby because neither of us could face going up to a room yet. She had her jacket off. She never had her jacket off in front of associates. She had folded it once and laid it across the back of the chair beside her, and her sleeves were down because Vienna Hollis did not roll sleeves in front of anyone, but the shirt collar was a single button looser than I had ever seen it, and she was drinking a whiskey she had not asked permission of anyone to order, and her hair was still pinned because Vienna Hollis would have set the hotel on fire before she let an associate see her with her hair down. We did not talk about the case. We talked, instead, about a clerkship she had done in her late 20s for a federal judge in the Ninth Circuit who had once thrown a stapler at a different clerk for a typo. I had not known any of this. I had not known any of the personal things I learned in the next 40 minutes, the year she had spent in Spain after college, the brother who had taught her to drive on an Italian hill in a manual transmission, the fact that she had been a swimmer in high school and had broken a state record her senior year that had stood for 9 years before some sophomore broke it, and Vienna had sent the sophomore a handwritten note. None of it was about her current life. All of it was old. All of it was the version of her that existed before whatever had happened 9 years earlier had taught her to not say things like this in hotel bars to associates. She drank the whiskey. She did not order another. After the first 40 minutes, the conversation slowed, the way conversations slow when both people understand that they are at the edge of something. She said, "I should let you sleep." I said, "I'm not tired." She said, "I am." She said it the way a person says a thing that is true on more than one level. She put her jacket back on. She paid the check before I could pretend to. We walked to the elevator. The elevator was small, mirrored on 3 sides, the kind of small old hotel elevator where 2 people stand close to each other, not by choice, but by the geometry of the space. We were on the same floor. The elevator went up 6 floors. The cedar and citrus was very close. She did not look at me in the mirrored wall. I did not look at her. The numbers above the door changed slowly. When the doors opened, she said, "Good night, Tate." I said, "Good night, Vienna." She walked left. I walked right. I went into my room and did not turn on the lights for 10 minutes. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and felt the entire building around me hum the way buildings hum when no one is awake. And I understood, for the first time without any plausible deniability, that Vienna Hollis was a woman who had been holding herself together for 3 years on the structural assumption that I did not know. I knew. She knew that I knew. The hotel air was cold. I sat in the dark for an hour and did not let myself cross the hall. She did not let herself cross the hall. Both of us got on the 7 a.m. flight back to New York the next morning and did not, for the next 11 months, refer to the bar conversation in any way, ever. That was the closest we ever came. After London, I made a different kind of peace with what I was doing. I stopped pretending the tension was a thing I could resolve by working harder or being more useful. The tension was the architecture. The tension was, in fact, the thing that allowed both of us to keep functioning. As long as it was unspoken, it could be managed. As long as it could be managed, neither of us had to make a decision. The decision, when it came from outside. It came in the form of a junior associate named Sutton Reed. Sutton was a second year. She was 25. She had been assigned to my team at the start of my third year, because I was the senior associate now, and I needed to be staffing junior associates rather than being staffed under, and she was very good. She was also, I noticed and pretended not to notice, the kind of woman whose presence in a room reorganized a small amount of attention. She was not flirtatious, she was professional, but she had a low laugh and a habit of leaning on a doorframe with one shoulder when she came into your office to ask a question. And on a Tuesday in November, Vienna walked past my open door at 6 p.m., while Sutton was leaning on the doorframe and laughing about something I had said that I do not even remember now. Vienna did not stop. She did not slow down. She did not look in. I felt her go past the door the way you feel a freight train pass an unsecured stack of papers. I worked the rest of the night. At 10 p.m., I went to Vienna's office because I had a question on the brief I was drafting that genuinely needed her input, and she was at her desk, and she answered the question, and her answer was the cleanest, sharpest, fastest answer she had given me in 3 years. The answer took 90 seconds. She did not look up from her screen for any of it. When she finished, she said, "Anything else?" And I said no. And she said, "Good night, Tate." I went back to my office. I sat at my desk. I understood that something had moved. The next morning, Sutton was reassigned. The reassignment came through an email from the staffing partner. It was framed as a development opportunity for Sutton, who would now be working on a securities matter under a different partner. There was no reason given, because there did not need to be a reason. Vienna Hollis ran the largest book of business in the firm. If she wanted a junior associate moved off her team, the junior associate moved. Sutton came by my office to say goodbye. She said, "I'm sorry, Tate. I really enjoyed working with you. I do not know what I did wrong." I said, "You did not do anything wrong." She said, "I figured. It just felt abrupt." I said, "It was not about you." She looked at me. She was 25, she was sharp. She read the look on my face and then she read the rest of the room. My office, the partner hallway visible through the open door, the corner of Vienna's office at the end of it. She said, "Ah." I said, "Please do not say that to anyone." She said, "Of course not. I'm not. I have eyes." She picked up her things. At the door she paused. She said, "For what it's worth. She is very subtle, but she is not as subtle as she thinks." She left. I sat at my desk and put my face in my hands for 30 seconds. Then I got up and walked down the hall and stood in Vienna's doorway. She was at her desk. She looked up. I said, "You reassigned Sutton." She said, "I did not reassign Sutton. The staffing partner reassigned Sutton." I said, "At your request." She said, "At the request of the practice group." "Which had a need?" I said, "Vienna." She said, "What?" I said, "That is not a reason that is going to survive my asking you about it twice." She put down her pen. She looked at me. She said, "What would you like me to say?" I said, "I would like you to not move junior associates off my team because you are jealous of their doorframes." She did not move. The composure did one very small thing, a thing I had been cataloging for 3 years and had never seen do exactly this, which was that her jaw set in a way that was not severe, but was, instead, defended. She said, "The reassignment was appropriate. Sutton needs broader exposure. The fact that you are reading anything else into it is your business. I said, all right. She said, Tate. I said, no. It's all right. I will not bring it up again. I went back to my office. I sat down. I did not work for an hour. That night, I sent the first email of my career to a recruiter, not a recruiter at any specific firm, a recruiter generally, a friend of a law school classmate who placed senior associates and counsel candidates at firms across the country. I told her I was open to conversations. I told her my parameters. I sent the email and closed my laptop and did not go back to the hotel bar in my mind, even though the hotel bar in my mind was where I lived now, on the nights when I let myself live anywhere. The recruiter wrote back the next morning. She had 3 firms in mind. One of them was Hadley Crane Partners. I told her to put me in touch with Brennan Crane. The phone call with Brennan Crane was on a Thursday 2 months later. It lasted 45 minutes. He was funny in the way that people who have left big firms for their own boutiques are funny, relaxed, a little mean about his old colleagues, completely confident in the rightness of the choice he had made 15 years ago. He read me a section of a brief I had written and asked me which paragraph I had drafted. I told him. He laughed. He said, "Kid, you ghost wrote that brief, and Vienna signed it because Vienna is too smart not to know whose voice was carrying it." I said, "I do not know about that." He said, "I do. I worked under Vienna for 4 years. I know exactly how she runs an associate. The fact that you are still there at year 3 means she has decided you are worth keeping around past the point at which she would have promoted you. Do you understand what I am saying?" I said, "I am not sure." He said, "Vienna does not keep good associates. She graduates them. She has graduated me, and 3 other people who are now partners at Latham, Sullivan, and Wachtel. She has never, in 15 years that I am aware of, kept an associate at the senior level past the year at which the firm would normally elevate them or push them out. You are at year 3. Why do you think that is?" I did not answer. He said, "I know why I think that is. I am not going to say it on this phone call. What I am going to say is that I would like you to come work for me, and the offer I am about to send you is an offer I have never made to anyone before, and it is an offer that exists because I have been on the other side of Vienna Hollis's structural decisions, and I have a great deal of professional sympathy for the structural position you are in." I did not say anything for a long moment. He said, "Take the weekend. Read the term sheet. Do not tell Vienna about this until you have decided. Do not let her steer this decision for you. The whole point is that you make this one yourself." He hung up. I sat in my office for a long time. The term sheet came that afternoon. I read it 6 times. The job offer became real on a Tuesday in February, a boutique litigation firm in Chicago. Founder was a former Vienna Hollis associate 10 years her senior, who had left Whitfield Sterling Hollis 15 years ago to start his own shop and had built it into the most respected litigation boutique in the Midwest. He had read a brief I had written and ghostwritten for Vienna in a Seventh Circuit appeal, and he had figured out from the structure of the argument that I had drafted it, and he had called me directly without going through a recruiter. He offered me counsel, not partner. Counsel was a non-equity position, but it was 3 years ahead of where I was at Whitfield, and it came with a book of business he was prepared to hand me on day 1, and it came with a salary that was 40% higher than what I was making, and it came with the chance to argue cases under my own name in a court system where my name would actually be on the briefs. It also came with a city that was 900 miles from Vienna Hollis. I sat with the offer for a week. I did not tell anyone. I read the term sheet 6 times. I called my mother who, when I told her about the offer in the most neutral terms I could construct, said only, "Tate, are you happy where you are?" And I said yes, and she said in a voice I have known my whole life, That was it. That was her entire input. The next morning, I emailed the founder of the Chicago firm and accepted. I waited to tell Vienna because I was a coward. I told myself it was because the timing of the resignation needed to be coordinated with the active case docket, which was true, and which was also not the reason. The reason was that I knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent 3 years reading the smallest tells of the most controlled human being she had ever met, that telling Vienna Hollis I was leaving was going to be the moment that the architecture of the past 3 years either collapsed or held. I did not know which one I wanted. I do not think she did either. 2 days before I went to her office, Margot Ivor caught me in the kitchenette on 42. She was making tea, which was the only thing I had ever seen her do in the kitchenette, because Margot did not eat firm food. She said, "You got an offer." I said, "How did you know?" She said, "You are walking like a person who has gotten an offer. You are also being slightly nicer to me than usual, which is the second tell." I said, "I'm leaving." She poured the hot water, did not look up. She said, "When are you telling Vienna?" I said, "Thursday?" She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "No." She said, "Good. The ones who think they're ready are the ones who get hurt." She put the tea bag in, stirred, looked at me. She said, "Listen to me. Whatever happens in that office on Thursday, I want you to remember one thing. Vienna Hollis has spent 9 years constructing her composure as a survival mechanism. It is not a weapon she uses against you. It is a wall she has built around herself. If you push it and it cracks, it will crack inward. Not at you. Toward her." I said, "I don't know what you mean." Margot said, "You will." She picked up her tea and walked back to her office. Thursday at 4:15 p.m., I knocked on Vienna Hollis's door. "Come in." She was at her desk. She was reading a printed brief with a fountain pen in her hand, and she had not yet made a mark on the page, which meant she had been reading the same page for a while. The light in her office was the late afternoon Manhattan light, low and gold, the kind that made the floor-to-ceiling glass look as if it were holding back an actual color. She did not look up. I said, "Do you have a minute?" She said, "For you. Always. Sit." I closed the door behind me. I sat in the chair across from her desk. The chair I had sat in approximately 1,000 times over 3 years. The cedar and citrus was very faint in the room. She did not wear it heavily. Never had. And the platinum watch was on her right wrist, and the pen had not moved. She looked up. She read my face. I watched her read it. I watched the half-second pause before her thumb pressed, once, against the underside of the fountain pen. She set the pen down. She said, "You've gotten an offer." I said, "Yes." She said, "Where?" I said, "Chicago. Hadley Crane Partners." A flicker. Just behind the eyes, Brennan Crane was the founder, her former associate, the man who had left Whitfield Sterling Hollis 15 years ago and started his own firm and never spoken to her in public since. She said, "What's the role?" I said, "Counsel." Book of business on day 1, 2-year track to non-equity partner. She said, "The package." I told her the package. She did not respond immediately. She looked at her desk, the fountain pen, the brief she had not been reading, the window, the Manhattan light. She said, "You'd be excellent there." I said, "I know." She said, "When do you start?" I said, 6 weeks. I'd want to wrap the Selbridge motion first. She said, "You should. The judge has gotten used to your voice on it. Switching counsel midstream would cost the client." I said, "I'll handle the transition." She said, "Of course." She picked up the fountain pen. "Put it down again." She said, "Tate." I said, "Yes." She said, "This is the right move for you." She said it the way you say something that has cost you to say. Quietly. Without looking up. The way she said almost everything, except that this one had a small, almost imperceptible rasp at the end of it that I had never heard from her in 3 years. I said, "Thank you." She nodded. She said, "Was there anything else?" I said no. I stood up. I went to the door. I had the handle in my hand. I opened it. I should have walked through. I should have walked through and gone back to my desk and sent the email to HR and started the wind down on the Selbridge motion and let the architecture of the past 3 years remain intact, exactly as Vienna Hollis had spent 3 years building it. I did not walk through. I do not know why. I do not know if I knew, in that moment, that I was going to do something. I do not know if my hand would have moved to close the door anyway, on its own, the way a body sometimes makes a decision before the mind has caught up. What I know is that I paused, with the door open, half turned, half already leaving. And I said, "Vienna." She had not moved. She was still at the desk. The fountain pen was in her hand again, and she was looking at the brief. But I had been reading her face for 3 years, and I knew that she had not been looking at the brief for the entire conversation. She looked up. I said, "Is there nothing you want to say?" The silence that followed was the longest silence I have ever heard. It was the silence at the bottom of a well. It was the silence inside a courtroom in the second before a verdict is read. It was the silence of a woman who had spent 9 years constructing her composure as a survival mechanism, and who was now sitting at her desk being asked, by an associate she had asked HR to find, whether she had anything to say. She looked at me. She said, "No." The word landed between us like a glass that had been set down too carefully. I said, "All right." I turned. I walked through the door. I closed it behind me. I was halfway down the hall when I realized she had stood up. I do not know how I knew. The architecture of her movement. Maybe. 3 years of cataloging every small physical signal she had ever permitted herself, and even through a closed door, I could feel the room behind me change shape. I kept walking. I did not turn around. I told myself I had asked the question, and she had given me her answer, and the answer was the answer. It was not the answer. I reached my office. I sat down. I stared at my screen. The cursor blinked in an empty email I had been drafting to HR. I sat there for 40 minutes. I do not know what I was waiting for. Then I got up. I walked back down the hallway. The associate offices were quiet. It was past 5, and most of my year class had gone home or was at the gym or was in some other office somewhere being collegial. The partner hallway, which dead-ended at Vienna's corner, was darker than usual. The cleaning crew had not yet come through. Her door was closed. I knocked. "Come in." I opened the door. She was standing at the window, not at her desk. Her back was to me. Her hair was still pinned. She was still in the suit jacket. The platinum watch caught the last of the afternoon light, which had gone, by now, almost entirely purple. She did not turn around. She said, "Tate." I said. I lied. She turned around. I said, "I'm not leaving because Hadley Crane offered me a better package. I'm leaving because I cannot stay here and live the rest of my life pretending I do not know what you do not say." The silence then was different from the silence at 4:15. It was not the silence of a well. It was the silence of a wire pulled tight. She said, "Tate." I said, "You do not have to say it. You do not have to say any of it. I am not asking you to say it. I am telling you why I'm going, because the version of me who walks out of this firm without telling you is a coward, and I have spent 3 years being a coward, and I would like to leave as something else." She did not move. She had not moved since she turned around. She said, "What version are you trying to leave as?" I said, "Honest." She said, "Then say the rest of it." I said, "The rest of what?" She said, "Tate. Say the rest." I said, "I can't." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because if I say it and you say what you said earlier, no, I am going to walk out of this office and never recover from it." She closed her eyes. Once. Briefly. The kind of closing that lasts less than a second, and that I had only seen her do twice before in 3 years, both times in the deposition of a witness who had said something so disrespectful that I had thought, for one full second, that she might cross the table. She opened them. She said, "I am not going to say no to you twice in the same afternoon. Speak." I said, I have been in love with you since the second month of my first year, and I have spent 3 years pretending I wasn't, because the only thing worse than losing my job over it was losing your respect. She did not move. I said, I'm leaving because I would rather lose you completely than spend the next 10 years standing in the next office over from you and pretending that is enough. The room was very quiet. She said, sit down. I said, no. She said, Tate. I said, no. I have said the thing. I have said all of the thing. You said no at 4:15, and I am not going to sit down so that you can say no a second time more comfortably. If you are going to say it, you can say it standing up. She moved. One step. From the window toward the desk. Stopped. She said, I did not say no at 4:15. I said, you did. She said, I said there was nothing I wanted to say. That is not the same thing. I stared at her. She said, there is a great deal I want to say. There is none of it that I am professionally entitled to say. Those are not the same problem. I said, I'm resigning. As of this conversation, effective at the end of the wind down on Selbridge, I am no longer your associate. So whatever the professional problem is, the professional problem will resolve itself in approximately 5 weeks. She said, that does not change what I am. Until then, allowed to say. I said, then say it after. She said, I will. I said, that is not enough. She said, what is enough? I said, tell me one true thing now. One. Something you would not have said at 4:15. Something you would not have said any time in the last 3 years. One true thing, Vienna, before I walk out of this office. She looked at me. She said, I asked HR to find you. I said, I know. She said, I read your clerkship memo and asked HR to find you, and I told myself it was because your circuit split analysis was the cleanest piece of associate-level writing I had read in 5 years. I said, was it? She said, yes. I said, was that the reason? She said, no. I waited. She said, I had also seen a photograph of you, a clerkship class photograph that ran in the alumni magazine of your law school, which I read because Brennan Ashford went there, and I should not have remembered a photograph in an alumni magazine. And I did. And when I read the memo and saw your name, I asked HR to find you. I could not breathe. She said, that is one true thing. Do not ask me for a second one in this room. I am not capable of giving it to you in this room. I said, all right. She said, walk out. I said, what? She said, walk out, Tate. Now. Before either of us says anything else, we are going to wrap Selbridge. We are going to do it cleanly and on schedule. You are going to leave for Chicago, and you are going to be excellent at Hadley Crane. And then, at some point after you are no longer my associate, and after the firm is no longer the structure between us, I am going to call you, and I am going to say the second true thing. Now walk out. I turned. I went to the door. I had my hand on the handle. I said, Vienna. She said, what? I said, I was wrong about one thing. She said, what? I said, I do not love you because you asked HR to find me. I would have loved you if you had ignored my memo and never noticed me at all. I want you to know that, before the next 5 weeks of wrap-up, because I do not want you to spend any of them thinking that this was something you caused. She did not respond for a long moment. Then she said, Tate. I said, yes. She said, walk out. I opened the door. I walked through. I had the door half closed behind me, and then her hand hit the wall beside my head. I had not heard her cross the room. I had not heard her come up behind me. She was Vienna Hollis. She did not move that fast, and she did not move that loudly, and she did not put her palm against a wall in any room I had ever been in with her. The frame holding her bar admission rattled. She said, into the small space between her hand and the door, into the air just behind my left ear. Say that again. I did not turn around. I said, which part? She said, the last part. I said, the part where I would have loved you if you had never noticed me. She said, yes. That part. Say it again. I said, I would have loved you anyway. I felt her breath then, behind my ear. A single uneven exhale from a woman who I had never, in 3 years, heard breathe unevenly in any room about anything. She stepped back. I heard the small distinct sound of her shoes on the carpet as she moved away from the door. I turned. She was standing 2 feet from me. Her hand was still raised, not yet at her side, like a woman whose body had moved before her mind had caught up. Her face was— I had no template for her face. The composure was gone, not collapsed. Suspended. Held in some place where she had not yet decided what to put back into it. She said, "Close the door." I said, "I'm not your associate anymore." She said, "I know. Close the door." I closed the door. She was still standing 2 feet from me. Her hand was still where it had been a moment ago. Slightly raised, palm half open, like a person whose body had completed an action without consulting her about it. The platinum watch caught the lamplight. The cedar and citrus was very close. She lowered her hand. Slowly, deliberately. The way she did everything when she was making sure her body did the thing her composure could approve of. She said, "Sit down." I said, "I am not going to sit down." She said, "All right." She moved past me. She went to her desk. She did not sit either. She put her hands flat on the surface of the desk and looked at the window for a long moment, and I watched her shoulders rise on a single breath and lower on a longer one. The Manhattan light was almost gone now. The room had taken on the dim amber that her lamp made when the city outside had lost the rest of its color, and the only thing that was still entirely sharp was her profile against the glass. Then she said, "The next 5 weeks are going to be very difficult." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am going to do my job. I am going to wrap Selbridge. I am going to write your transition letter. I am going to ensure the file handoff to whoever inherits the matter on the Hadley Crane side. I am going to be your supervising partner until your last day, because that is what the institutional structure requires of me, and because failing to perform that role would be a worse signal to the firm than performing it would be." I said, "All right." She said, "I am also going to call Brennan Ashford in the morning." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because there is a partner-level conflict of interest disclosure that I have failed to make in this firm for 3 years. It is not your job to know whether I make it. It is my job to make it. I am going to make it. The institutional response is the firm's to determine. Whatever they ask of me, I will accept." I said, "You do not have to do that." She said, "I do." She turned around. She was holding the desk now with the back of her thighs, the way she sometimes leaned against a podium in a courtroom when she had finished an argument and was waiting for the response. Her hands were at her sides. Her face had reassembled enough composure to be functional, which was different from being whole. She said, "Tate." "Listen." I said, "Listening." She said, "I have spent 3 years making sure that no part of what I felt for you affected the assignments I gave you, the cases I handed you, the trajectory of your career inside this firm. I believe that I succeeded. I believe that the work you were given was the work you earned. I believe that the trust I placed in you was trust you had earned. I have to believe that, because if I am wrong about that, then what I have done to you for 3 years is not survivable." I said, "You did not do anything to me. You were a good partner." She said, "That is the version I have told myself." She breathed once. The breath was as uneven as the one I had heard behind my ear at the door. She said, "What I have not been able to tell myself is that I should have disclosed the conflict the moment I understood it existed, which was, by my own honest accounting, sometime in your first 6 months. I should have gone to Brennan and asked to recuse from supervising you. I should have let another partner take that role. I did not do that. I told myself the work would not be affected. I told myself I could manage it. And I have managed it. And the work was not affected. But the management itself has been a thing that has cost you something I cannot now give back." I said, "Vienna." She said, "What?" I said, "Did the work being good give you any pleasure? Or was it only ever a thing you were grading yourself against?" She looked at me. She said, "Both." The work being good gave me more pleasure than it should have. That was part of the problem. I said, "That is the most flattering thing anyone has ever said to me." She said, "Do not laugh, Tate. Not in this room. Not tonight." I said, "I am not laughing." She said, "I know." She said, "I am going to call Brennan in the morning. The disclosure will not change anything for you on the merits. Your wind down will simply happen with another supervising partner, which will be administratively cleaner anyway. The disclosure exists for me, so that I can leave the room I have been standing in for 3 years." I said, "What room?" She said, "The one where I get to keep working with you and not have to account for what that has been." I said, "Are you going to take leave?" She said, "I do not know yet. The firm will tell me what is appropriate. I will accept what they tell me." I said, "That is a remarkable amount of faith in an institution." She said, "The institution has been good to me. It is mine to repay." I said, "All right." She said, "When you walk out of this office tonight, we are not going to do this again. We are going to do the work. We are going to be professional with each other. We are not going to have any conversation that is not entirely about the work. Until your last day. Do you agree to that?" I said yes. She said, "After your last day, after you are no longer my associate, and the structure between us is gone, I am going to call you, and you can decide then whether you want to take the call." I said, "All right." She said, "I am going to call you regardless, so that the choice is yours and not mine to make for you." I said, "All right." She said, "Anything else?" I said, "One thing." She said, "What?" I said, "The second true thing, the one you said you would tell me when I was no longer your associate. I am not going to ask you for it now. I am not going to ask you for it tonight. But I want you to know that I will not assume, because you have not said it, that it does not exist. I will wait the 5 weeks. I will wait however long after the 5 weeks. But I am not going to spend those weeks assuming you have changed your mind." She said, "Do not." I said, "All right." She said, "Tate." I said, "What?" She said, "Walk out." I said, "I am." I went to the door. I had my hand on the handle. I said, "Good night, Vienna." She said, "Good night, Tate." I walked out. I did not look back. I did not go back to my office. I went straight to the elevator, which I rode down to the lobby with my back to the mirrored wall. Because I did not trust myself to look at my own face, I walked out of the building. I got in a cab. I gave the driver an address that was nowhere near my apartment because I needed 30 more minutes of moving before I could face being in a room that was not also moving, and the driver, who had been driving cabs in Manhattan for 30 years, took one look at my face and did not ask whether I was sure about the address. I sat in the back of the cab and let the city move past the window, and somewhere around 42nd Street I understood that what had just happened in Vienna Hollis's office was the most honest thing that had ever been said to me by another human being, and that the cost of being honest with her in return was that I now had to leave a city I had built a life in and trust that the woman who had told me she would call would, in fact, call. I trusted her. That was the unsettling part. I trusted her completely. Brennan Ashford called me into his office on Monday at 9. He was the managing partner, 68 years old, the kind of person who had been at Whitfield Sterling Hollis since the 1970s and had treated me with the polite formality he treated all senior associates with, neither warm nor cold, just the steady professional attention of a person who was good at running a partnership. He had me sit. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, and one in front of the chair I sat in. He said, "Vienna disclosed a conflict to me on Saturday morning." I said, "I am aware she intended to." He said, "I understand. I have spoken with the firm's general counsel. I am not going to discuss the substance of the disclosure with you, because it is not substance you need to manage. What I want to tell you is 2 things." I said, "All right." He said, "The first is that Vienna will not be your supervising partner for the remainder of your time here. Margot Ivor is taking over Selbridge effective today. Vienna will be available as a consulting resource if Margot needs her, but she will not be in the room with you." I said, "Understood." He said, "The second is that this firm is going to give you a clean exit. We are going to give you the bonus you have earned this fiscal year. We are going to give you a recommendation letter signed by myself and by Margot, and not by Vienna, which I think you will understand the reasoning behind. We are going to make sure that whatever happens next in your career happens with our full institutional support behind you. I said, "Thank you, Brennan." He said, "You do not need to thank me. You earned what you earned. The firm is simply ensuring that the institutional record reflects that." He drank his coffee. He said, "Tate." I said, "Yes." He said, "I have known Vienna Hollis for 21 years. I am not going to comment on the substance of what she disclosed. What I am going to say is that you are not the first person who has been on the difficult side of an institutional structure that did not have a clean answer. You will not be the last. The firm has procedures for this. The procedures are not warm. They are designed to protect the institution and the people inside it. They are also occasionally designed to give people permission to be honest when honesty would otherwise cost them something they cannot afford to lose." I said, "I understand." He said, "Good. Now go. Margot is expecting you in her office." I left. The next 4 weeks were strange in the specific way that endings are strange. Margot ran Selbridge with the comfortable efficiency of a partner who had been waiting to take a case off Vienna's desk for years. She was good. She let me run the parts of the matter I had been running. She trusted me with the briefing. She asked me twice what I needed and listened both times. Vienna was in the building. I knew, because she did not ask for leave, and because the partner hallway lights in her corner came on at 6:30 every morning the way they always had. I did not see her in the partner hallway. I did not see her in the kitchenette. I did not see her in any conference room. We were on the same floor. The geometry of the building should have made avoidance impossible. The geometry of Vienna Hollis when she had decided something made avoidance precise. I caught one glimpse of her in the 4 weeks. It was a Wednesday. I was coming out of the elevator on 42 with a takeout coffee, and she was at the far end of the partner hallway with her back to me, walking toward her office. She did not turn around. She did not slow down. She did not, as far as I could tell, register the elevator opening. The cedar and citrus did not reach me at that distance. I had to construct it from memory. I worked. Margot worked beside me. Selbridge filed on schedule. The motion was granted on the schedule we had projected. The client called Margot to thank her and asked her to thank me, and that was the work concluded. My last day was a Friday in the middle of March. The firm had a cake. There was a small gathering in the kitchenette at 4 p.m. Brennan Ashford gave a brief, dignified speech that did not mention Vienna at all. Margot gave a speech that was warmer and ended with a sentence she had clearly thought about. "Tate is the first associate I have not been ready to graduate, which means we waited too long, and Brennan Crane is going to get the version of her she should have been here." The room laughed. I laughed. I did not cry, because I had decided in advance that I was not going to cry, and I had practiced not crying in the same way I had once practiced the sentence I had used to walk into Vienna's office 5 weeks earlier. Vienna was not at the cake. I had not expected her to be. I had also known I would notice she was not. I was packing the last of my things from my office at 6 when there was a knock at the door. It was not Vienna. It was Sutton Reed, the junior associate who had been reassigned. She was holding a small bag from a coffee place on Lexington that the firm associates patronized in lieu of caring about coffee. She said, "I am not staying. I just wanted to say goodbye." I said, "That is very kind. Come in." She came in. She set the bag on my desk. She said, "I do not know what happened. I do not need to know what happened. I just wanted you to know that the way you handled it, me, the reassignment, all of it, was the most professional thing I have ever seen anyone in this building do, and I have learned a lot from watching you. And I am going to be a better lawyer because of how you ran a team for the 11 weeks I was on yours." I said, "Sutton?" She said, "I know. Please do not get sentimental. I will start crying. I have been emotionally compromised since lunch." I said, "All right." She said, "Good luck in Chicago." I said, "Thank you." She left. I sat at my desk and opened the bag. It was a sandwich. The right sandwich. From the right place. The handwritten note inside the bag was not from Sutton. The handwriting was small, precise, and unmistakable. It said, "Eat before your flight. V." I sat with the note for a long time. Then I folded it once, carefully, and put it in my wallet. And I have not, in the time since, taken it out for any reason other than to look at it. I left the building at 7:15. I did not look down the partner hallway. I knew what I would not see. Chicago in March is gray. Chicago in April is also gray. Chicago in May becomes briefly beautiful and then becomes summer, which is its own problem. I started at Hadley Crane Partners on the first Monday of April. Brennan Crane had cleared the morning of my first day, which he did for new senior hires, the way he claimed he had been doing for 15 years, which Margot Ivor had told me on the phone the night before was nonsense. She was certain he had cleared the morning specifically for me, because he was a man who had structured his entire career around being a different kind of partner than Vienna Hollis was. And welcoming her former senior associate with a cleared morning was a gesture both warm and pointed. He gave me the office tour. He introduced me to my new team. He took me to lunch at a place near the river that did not pretend to be impressed with anyone. He told me about his 3 children and his second wife, and the specific way he had decided, 15 years earlier, that the version of partnership he had been on track to inherit at Whitfield was not the version of partnership he wanted to live inside. He did not, at any point, ask me about Vienna. I appreciated that. The work was good. The work was, in fact, the version of the work Brennan had promised it would be. Cases under my own name, briefs with my voice, courtrooms where I argued my own motions in front of judges who learned my face and learned to expect a particular kind of preparation when I walked into their courtrooms. I won my first jury trial in my 5th month. I lost my second in my 7th. On a charge I had been straightforwardly outgunned on, and I learned things from losing that I had never had the chance to learn at Whitfield, because Vienna had structured my career so that I had never been straightforwardly outgunned. I made counsel at the end of my first year. The promotion letter was signed by Brennan and the 2 named partners, and was, by the standards of any firm I had ever worked at, generous beyond what had been promised in the term sheet. I framed it. I hung it on the wall of my office, beside the bar admission and beside a photograph of my mother that she had emailed me from her phone, with the caption, "You better be eating," and which I had printed out and framed because I have always taken my mother's instructions more seriously than I take most other people's. I did not hear from Vienna. This was correct. This was the agreement. This was the structure she had built into the conversation we had at the end of my last day in her office. And Vienna Hollis was a woman who kept structural agreements. I did not call her either. This was less correct. This was, I knew, a thing I was doing because if I called her first, I would not be able to live with the imbalance of having broken the structure I had agreed to. The structure said she would call me. The structure said the choice would be mine to take the call, or not take it. If I called her, I would be deciding for both of us, which was the thing she had been honest about not wanting to do. So I waited. 6 months, 8 months, 11 months. In December of my first full year at Hadley Crane, I was walking out of the federal courthouse on a cold Tuesday after winning a motion to dismiss in a case I had been carrying since June, and my phone buzzed in my coat pocket, and I took it out without looking, and the name on the screen was Vienna Hollis. I stopped on the courthouse steps. The cold went through my coat in the precise way Chicago cold goes through coats in December. I answered. I said, "Vienna," she said. "Tate," she said. "Do you have a minute?" I said. "I am on the courthouse steps." She said. "You won." I said. "How do you know?" She said. "The docket. I have been keeping track of your cases." I said. "Of course you have." She said. "I am calling because the structural arrangement we agreed to is concluded as of 3 weeks ago, when the firm closed the disclosure file on me and ended my consultancy agreement with Whitfield. I am, as of 3 weeks ago, no longer your former supervising partner under any institutional definition the Bar Association would recognize." I said, Are you with another firm? She said, I am not. I am taking a year. I have not done that since I was 26. I am told it is, in moderation, a reasonable thing for a person to do. I said, Who told you that? She said, Margot. Repeatedly. For 9 months. I laughed. I had not expected to laugh. The laugh came out short and surprised. She said, I would like to see you. If that is something you would be willing to do. I said, when? She said, whenever you can. I do not have a schedule. I said, this weekend. I am free Saturday. She said, where? I said, Chicago. She said, I will be there Saturday. I said, all right. There was a pause. The wind on the courthouse steps was loud. She said, I told you I would call. I said, I know. She said, it took longer than I hoped. The firm took longer than I hoped. I did not want to call you in the middle of an institutional process I was still inside. I said, I understood that. I assumed that was why. She said, thank you for assuming that. I said, Vienna. She said, what? I said, I am very glad you called. She said, I am very glad you took the call. She said, Saturday. I said, Saturday. We hung up. I stood on the courthouse steps for another 10 minutes. The cold had gotten worse. My hands were shaking, which was the kind of shaking I had not done since my first appellate argument 3 years ago, and which had nothing at all to do with the temperature. She arrived on Saturday at 11 a.m. I had given her an address. A small place on the west side of the city, a neighborhood she would not have known and could not have predicted. A coffee shop I had chosen specifically because no one inside it would recognize either of us, and because the chairs were comfortable, and because it was the kind of place that had decided at some point that it was going to be a good coffee shop and was not going to be anything else. She came in at 5 minutes past 11. She was in dark jeans. I had never seen Vienna Hollis in jeans. I had never seen Vienna Hollis in anything that was not a suit, or, on the rare professional occasion, a dress that was structurally indistinguishable from a suit. She was in dark jeans and a gray cashmere sweater and a long wool coat the color of a January river, and her hair was down. I had also never seen her hair down. She found me at the table near the back. She set her coat on the chair beside her. She sat. The cedar and citrus reached me across the table, faint, the same as it had been in her office, the same as it had been in the elevator in London, the same as it had been the morning she set a sandwich on my desk that had no name on the bag. She said, I am not entirely sure how to begin this conversation. I said, you have prepared remarks. She said, I have prepared remarks. I said, deliver them. The corner of her mouth did the thing it had done 1 millimeter at a time across 3 years, and that I had catalogued every iteration of. She said, Tate Marlowe. I said, Vienna Hollis. She said, I owe you a conversation that begins with an apology, which I am going to make brief, because the apology is real, and I do not want to let the length of it take up the space that should belong to the rest. I said, all right. She said, I should have disclosed the conflict in your first 6 months. I did not. I told myself the work was insulated from it, and I believed I was right about that, and I am still confident I was right about that. But the management was a thing I did not have the right to do alone, and I did it alone. And it cost you a version of the 3 years you should have had at that firm. The version where your work was being supervised by a partner whose relationship to you was uncomplicated. You did not have that. You should have had that. I am sorry. I said, accepted. She said, that fast. I said, that fast. Vienna, I have spent 14 months waiting for that sentence. I am not going to waste any of the next 14 minutes deliberating about whether to accept it. She said, fair. She said, the second thing I owe you is the second true thing. I said, you are not obligated. She said, I am obligated. I told you in my office that I would say it. I have spent 14 months thinking about how to say it. I am going to say it now, and I am going to say it correctly, because I have had the time to prepare, and I am not going to make you do the work of guessing what I mean. I said, "All right." She said, "Tate." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been in love with you since the second time I read a brief you had written in your first year, the one on standing in the Eighth Circuit. The brief was good. I had expected the brief to be good. What I had not expected was the particular shape of the way you constructed the argument, the way you set up the narrow holding 2 pages before you needed it, so that when the holding arrived, it looked inevitable. I had been writing briefs for 16 years at that point, and I had never seen a first year do that. I read it 3 times. The third time I read it, I understood that I was going to have to manage what I felt about the person who had written it, because what I felt was not professional admiration, and it was going to require a structure to contain. So I built the structure. The structure held for 3 years. It is no longer required, because you no longer work for me, and because I no longer work at the firm, and because I have spent 14 months accounting for what it cost both of us, and because I am sitting in a coffee shop in Chicago in dark jeans, which is not a thing I do, and I am telling you that I have been in love with you for 3.5 years, and that the structure I built was the most loving thing I knew how to do at the time, and that I am sorry it was not enough. I did not say anything for a long time. The coffee shop made coffee shop sounds around us. Someone was using an espresso machine at the counter. The door opened and closed. A baby was laughing at the table near the window. I said, "Vienna." She said, "What?" I said, "I have a question." She said, "Ask." I said, "When you said the structure was the most loving thing you knew how to do, was that all of it? Or was part of it that you were also afraid of what would happen if you did not build the structure?" She looked at me. She said both. I said, "What were you afraid of?" She said, "The woman I lived with for 11 years died 9 years ago. Margot probably told you. Margot told everyone Margot trusted, eventually, because Margot believed I should have to live in the daylight version of my own grief and refused to participate in any other version. I have been afraid, since she died, of caring about another person enough to be inside the geometry of caring about them again. I built a career out of work specifically, because work has a structure that protects you from that geometry. I was building you another structure for the same reason. The structure was for me. The structure was also, genuinely, for you. The fact that both things were true does not make either of them less true. I said, "All right." She said, "I am here today because I have decided that being inside the geometry of caring about another person again is something I am willing to risk, and because the person I have decided I am willing to risk it for is you, and because the decision is mine to make and yours to accept or decline, and I am not going to pretend it is anything else." I said, "Thank you for being clear." She said, "What would you like to do?" I said, "I would like to take a walk with you in this neighborhood, because it is a neighborhood I love and you have never seen it, and I would like you to see it." She said, "All right." We finished our coffee. She paid. She did not let me argue. We put on our coats. We walked out into the December cold, which was, as advertised, vicious in the specific Chicago way, and she did not flinch, and neither did I. She said, "Are you cold?" I said, "I am from Indiana. I am insulted by the question." She said, "My apologies." We walked. The neighborhood was the kind of neighborhood that has good light in December despite the weather. Low buildings, wide streets, the kind of architecture that lets the sky be visible from the sidewalk. I showed her the bookshop I went to on Saturdays, and the bakery where the woman who ran it had, at some point in the last 14 months, learned my order without my having to give it. I showed her the corner where I had once stopped to give directions to a couple visiting from Spain, and where my Spanish, which was bad but real, had been good enough to be useful. She listened. She listened the way she had always listened, which was completely, the way you listen when you are storing each sentence for later examination, and I realized as we walked that this was the first time she had ever listened to me about something that was not a case, and that the difference was substantial, and that I had not understood until this moment how much of who I was had been waiting for someone to listen to it without a billable purpose. We stopped at a small park near the river. The river was gray and slow and partially frozen at the edges, and the light over the water was the specific December light of a city that had decided to be beautiful despite itself. She said, "Tate." I said, "What?" She said, "I would like to do something." I said, "What?" She said, "I would like to put my hand on your face." I said, "All right." She did not move quickly. She moved the way she had always moved, economically, deliberately, the body following the decision of the mind without any waste. She raised her right hand. The platinum watch caught the cold light. Her palm settled against the side of my jaw, warm against the skin that had been cold for the last 40 minutes. Her thumb did one small thing, a single brief stroke at the corner of my mouth, that I had been imagining, on and off, for 3.5 years, and that was, in execution, more careful and more patient than anything I had imagined. I said, "Vienna." She said, "What?" I said, "Kiss me." She said, "I am." She did. The kiss was patient. It was the patience of a woman who had been waiting 3.5 years for something and was not going to spend any of it being frantic about it. It was warm. It was specific. It was... The only word I have for it is honest, which is a word I have been trying to live inside for the last 14 months, and which she had decided to put into the geometry of an actual physical thing on a sidewalk in a Chicago park in December. She pulled back. She said, "Was that all right?" I said, "That was correct." She said, "I have wanted to do that for 3.5 years." I said, "I have wanted you to do that for slightly less than that, but not by very much." She said, "When did you know?" I said, "The deposition trip in Houston, after Margot told me you had been in love with one woman in your life and had told yourself you were not going to be in love with another one. I had been pretending for the first year. After Houston, I knew. I did not act on it because you did not act on it, and because I was 27 and I did not understand how to act on anything that had no professional structure around it, and because I was a coward." She said, "You were not a coward. You were correct." I said, "I am still not entirely sure of the difference." She said, "I am." We walked out of the park. We walked back toward my apartment, which I had not invited her to, but which she had, somewhere in the previous 40 minutes, figured out we were walking toward. We did not say anything for a while. The cold was not a problem. The cold was, in fact, very nice, in the way the cold is nice when you are walking with someone you want to be walking with. She stayed in Chicago for the weekend. She got a hotel room because I did not ask her to stay at my apartment, and she did not ask whether I would have her at my apartment. And we agreed without speaking about it that the patience was going to extend to the rest of the weekend, because the patience was the entire architecture, and breaking it in the first 30 hours would have been a disservice to the 3.5 years that had built it. We had dinner Saturday night. We had brunch Sunday morning. She flew back to New York on Sunday evening from O'Hare, and I drove her to the airport. And at the curb she leaned across the console and kissed me again. And this time her hand stayed on my face for 1 second longer, and her thumb did the thing at the corner of my mouth a second time, and she said, "I am going to fly back next weekend." And I said, "All right." And she said, "And the weekend after that." And I said, "All right." And she got out of the car. She came back the weekend after that. She came back the weekend after that, too. By February, she was renting a place in Chicago for half the month. By April, she had taken on a single client at a Chicago boutique on a consulting basis, because being inside a courtroom occasionally was a thing she had decided she missed and was no longer going to pretend she did not. By June, she was in Chicago more than she was in New York, which she did not announce and did not narrate, and simply lived inside the way she lived inside everything she had decided was true. The first time we appeared together at a professional event was a bar association dinner in Chicago in October. I had been invited because Hadley Crane was honoring a former judge who had ruled on a case I had argued, and Vienna had come as my guest, which the invitation had given me the option of doing, and which we had, over the course of a conversation that took less than 30 seconds. Agreed was the option we were going to exercise. We walked in together. People noticed. Some of them were people who had known her for 20 years and had not known I existed. Some of them were people who had known me for 1 year and had no idea who she was. The combination of those two groups noticing the same thing at the same time was, I will admit, something I had been quietly looking forward to. Margot Ivor was there. Margot had retired from Whitfield Sterling Hollis the previous summer and had started consulting with a firm in Chicago, partly because her oldest grandchild was at Northwestern, and partly because she had been waiting for the excuse for years. She saw us cross the room. She was holding an old-fashioned. She raised the glass at us and did not bother coming over, because Margot did not need to come over to deliver a verdict. The raised glass was the verdict. Vienna saw it. The corner of her mouth moved 1 millimeter. I said, "You owe Margot something nice." She said, "I owe Margot something extravagant. I am going to send her the watch." I said, "The watch from your great-aunt? The platinum one?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Vienna, that is your watch." She said, "Margot is the reason I am at this dinner. The watch is structurally appropriate." I looked at her. She looked at me. The lights of the venue caught the corner of her jaw the way the lamplight had caught it the night I had told her I was leaving, 14 months and 1 day before this dinner, and I understood that the geometry of caring about another person had been the specific shape of the thing she had been afraid of, and that she had walked into it anyway, and that she was wearing it now the way she had always worn things. Economically, deliberately, completely. I said, "Give Margot a fountain pen. Keep the watch." She said, "I am keeping the watch." I said, "Good." We went to our table, we sat down. The dinner happened. Speeches were given. The judge gave a remarkable, brief, specific speech about the difference between law and justice that I will remember for the rest of my career. Vienna did not speak to anyone professionally except in passing. She was, that evening, simply a person at a dinner with another person, and it was the first time I had seen her in that role in a public setting, and it was, I will be honest, the most attractive thing I had ever seen her do. We left at 10. We walked back to my apartment, which was now also her apartment, in the precise way that a thing becomes also yours when you have been in it for half of every month for 10 months, and have, at some point, started to notice when the milk is running low without anyone having to mention it. At the door of the apartment, she paused before going in. She said, "Tate." I said, "What?" She said, "The second true thing I told you in the coffee shop. I have one more." I said, "You said you had one. You have been delivering them at the rate of approximately 1 a year. I am going to need you to revise the unit economics here." The corner of her mouth did the thing. She said, "The third true thing is that I had the recommendation letter Brennan wrote for you in February. The one that went into Hadley Crane's file. The one that went out from the firm under Brennan and Margot's signatures and not mine." I read it. I said, "All right." She said it was a good letter. It said correct things about you. It said the things the firm needed the receiving firm to know. I said, "But?" She said, "It did not say the thing I would have said, which is that you are the cleanest legal mind I have worked with in 20 years, and that the reason I knew you were worth keeping past the year I would have promoted you is that I had, by your second year, started reading every brief you wrote twice, the second time for pleasure, and that there is no professional version of that admission that any institutional letter could have contained, and so the institutional letter, while correct, was insufficient, and you should know that." I said, "I have known that since approximately Houston." She said, "I know. I am telling you anyway." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you said you were not going to spend the next 10 years standing in the next office over from me and pretending it was enough. And I have spent 14 months making sure that you do not have to. And the best version of making sure of that is the version where you know, at all times, what I would have said in any letter and any room and any setting where the institutional structure would not have allowed me to say it. I said, "All right." She said, "That was the third one. The fourth one is—" I said, "Vienna." She said, "What?" I said, "Come inside." She came inside. The door closed behind us. The work went on. The cases I argued. The cases she occasionally consulted on. The fact of two careers that had been built in different cities, and were now, by mutual decision, being lived in the same one. The fact of a relationship that had taken 3.5 years to permit itself, and that had spent 14 months earning itself, and that had, by the time we were sitting across from each other at a coffee shop in Chicago in December, been the most carefully accounted for thing either of us had ever done. It is possible to spend 3.5 years saying nothing. It is possible to spend 14 months doing the structural work that being silent for 3.5 years generates as a debt. It is also possible, after all of that, to walk into a coffee shop in December and to have the conversation you should have had 3.5 years before, and to do it correctly the second time, and to discover that the patience that produced the silence was the same patience that produces the rest of it. The watch is on her wrist still. It is on her right wrist. She has never explained why, and I have never asked. And one evening last June she told me anyway. The great aunt had been left-handed, and the watch had been hers, and Vienna had simply put it on the wrist that did not require her to take it off when she was writing. A practical answer to a question I had been wondering about for 4 years. She delivered it across a kitchen counter while pouring water for coffee, the way she delivered everything that mattered, which was without ceremony and with complete accuracy. The note from the bag with the sandwich is in my wallet still. It says, "Eat before your flight." V. I take it out sometimes, on flights. She knows I do this. I have not told her. She knows because she is Vienna Hollis and she watches everything, and the watching has, over time, become the thing I love most about being known by her. She knows, I know she knows. That is, in the end, what the geometry held. Two people who had decided to know each other completely, and who had paid the structural cost of doing it correctly, and who had arrived, finally, at the version of themselves where neither of them was managing anything anymore because there was no longer anything left to manage. The wall in her old office still has a small mark on it. I know because Margot told me. Margot is now consulting for the boutique that absorbed Vienna's practice during her sabbatical, and Margot was in the office one Tuesday last spring and noticed the mark and asked about it. And the new partner who occupies the office said she had no idea where it had come from, but had decided not to have it painted over because it gave the room character. Margot, who had been there the morning after, had looked at the mark and laughed for a full minute, and had then gone back to her own office and called Vienna in Chicago and told her about it, and Vienna had laughed too, and then she had told me, on a Sunday morning over coffee in our kitchen, and I had laughed, and I had said, "The institutional record," and she had said, "Indeed," and we had finished our coffee. The mark is still there. The new partner is still leaving it. It is, as Margot said, character.